President Trump visited police and National Guard troops in Washington, D.C. last night. While there, the president suggested that other cities could be next for a federal takeover.
I'm announcing a historic action to rescue our nation's capital from crime, bloodshed, bedlam, and squalor, and worse.
Imagine waking up in the heart of the United States Capitol streets, lined with historic monuments. The echoes of democracy etched into every marble wall. And yet, what greets you isn't the calm rhythm of city life, but the heavy footsteps of soldiers patrolling sidewalks. The nation's most powerful city, Washington, D.C., suddenly looks less like the symbol of American freedom and more like a city preparing for battle. This isn't a scene from a dystopian movie. It's real. The former president, Donald Trump, announced a sweeping plan to tighten his grip over Washington, D.C., claiming the city had descended into chaos. His solution? Deploy hundreds of National Guard troops, flood neighborhoods with federal law enforcement, and even wrest control of the city's police department. But behind the tough talk and the shock tactics lies a bigger question. Is this truly about crime? More about power? It's a unique position of Washington, D.C. To understand the weight of Trump's move, you first need to know what makes Washington, D.C. different from every other American city. Unlike New York, Los Angeles, or Chicago, D.C. is not part of any state. It's a federal district carved out in 1790 to serve as the permanent home of the U.S. government. That uniqueness gives the city an unusual structure. Residents elect their own mayor and city council thanks to the Home Rule Act of 1973, which granted a degree of local independence. But the independence is only partial. Congress still reviews the city's laws and budget. The president appoints the judges. And unlike every state, D.C. has no voting representation in Congress, even though more than 700,000 people call it home. That means when a president decides to flex federal authority in D.C., local leaders have fewer tools to push back. In this case, Trump seized that leverage and he did it in the most dramatic way possible. The emergency declaration. Trump declared that Washington had become a dangerous place, overrun with gangs, homeless encampments, and what he called roving mobs. He framed the city as a failing experiment of democratic leadership. To his supporters, he positioned himself as the savior, willing to restore order. The statistics, however, tell a more complicated story. While crime did spike in 2023, especially homicides, the numbers had already begun to fall in 2024 and continued to decline into 2025. By the time Trump acted, violent crime was down significantly. So why the dramatic show of force? The deployment was massive. 800 National Guard troops and 500 federal officers from agencies like the FBI, D, and ICE. On top of that, Trump announced that he was taking over the city's police department town move that pushed the boundaries of presidential authority and ignited outrage among local officials. A city on edge. The impact was immediate. Armed guards appeared near tourist landmarks. Federal officers stopped cars, patrolled neighborhoods, and made arrests, many targeting undocumented immigrants and clearing homeless camps. For some residents, this wasn't safety, it was intimidation. Tests quickly erupted. Videos of residents clashing with federal agents spread online, one even involving a thrown sandwich that became a strange symbol of defiance. The message from locals was clear. This wasn't just about fighting crime. It felt like their city was being occupied. Mayor Muriel Bowser, a Democrat, condemned the intervention as authoritarian, but was cautious in her resistance. Unlike governors and states, she doesn't have the same level of power to block federal deployments. That imbalance of authority left her walking a fine line, criticizing Trump's actions while avoiding open confrontation that could risk even harsher retaliation. The police takeover. Perhaps the boldest and most controversial part of Trump's move was his attempt to federalize the Metropolitan Police Department, MPD. Using a rarely invoked clause in the Home Rule Act, his administration argued that conditions justified an emergency takeover. Attorney General Pam Bondi even tried to replace D.C.'s Police Chief Pamela Smith with a Trump loyalist. The city fought back in court, and a judge signaled that Trump's team had overstepped. For the moment, Smith kept her job, but the confrontation left no doubt this wasn't simply about policing. It was a battle for control. Political chess. Why D.C.? Beyond the surface-level justification of crime, Washington, D.C. represents the heart of democratic political power. The city votes overwhelmingly blue in every election. It's also a symbol. If Trump can assert dominance here, he sends a message to other urban centers that resist his leadership, places like New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and Baltimore. For Trump, this was more than law and order. It was political chess. By spotlighting urban crime and blaming Democrats for disorder, he could shape the national conversation ahead of critical elections. The bigger picture. Beneath the headlines and nightly news coverage, one question looms. What precedent does this set? If a president can so easily declare a crisis and take direct control of a city, where does that authority end? Could other cities be next? For the people of Washington, the uncertainty was immediate. Soldiers patrolling peaceful areas, federal agents sweeping through neighborhoods, and the mayor's limited ability to push back left residents feeling both watched and powerless. For the rest of the country, it posed a chilling scenario. What if the capital of democracy itself becomes the testing ground for centralized control? A brewing storm. This is where the story of Washington, D.C. under Trump begins. A city caught between falling crime rates and rising federal power. A mayor stripped of her strength, and residents wondering whether the city they call home has become the stage for a much larger political drama. The soldiers are already here. The agents are already watching, and the question echoing across America is not whether Trump can take control of D.C., but whether D.C. is only the beginning. The first days of federal patrols in Washington, D.C. felt surreal. Tourists snapped photos of guardsmen standing near the Lincoln Memorial. Locals passed by armored vehicles on their morning commute, and families watched agents in tactical gear sweep through neighborhoods once considered relatively quiet. For many, the message was clear. This wasn't policing, it was a demonstration of power. But as weeks unfolded, what had started as a dramatic deployment began to spiral into a fierce, roused standoff between the federal government and the city itself. What was happening in D.C. was no longer just a local matter, it had become a national spectacle, with implications for every American city. The legal battlefield. The flashpoint came with Trump's move to seize control of the Metropolitan Police Department. On paper, he justified it through a rarely used clause of the Home Rule Act, arguing that the city was in a state of emergency. But in practice, it was seen as an audacious grab for authority. Mayor Muriel Bowser, usually cautious in her pushback, took a firmer stand here. She called the move unconstitutional, describing it as a brazen theft of local power. Almost immediately, the city filed lawsuits challenging the takeover. Courtrooms in the Capitol became battlegrounds as lawyers debated whether the president could unilaterally dismiss D.C.'s police chief and replace her with a political appointee. The initial ruling sided with the city chief Pamela Smith would remain in place, but the victory was bittersweet. The court also signaled that the president's emergency powers were broad and could still be expanded under the right circumstances. For D.C. leaders, it was a reminder of their precarious autonomy. They could win small battles, but the larger war remained stacked against them. Protests in the streets. While lawyers fought in court, ordinary residents fought in the streets. Protests swelled across the city. From college students to longtime community leaders, thousands marched with signs demanding Trump withdraw federal forces. Some demonstrations turned tense. Federal agents clashed with crowds, pepper spray was deployed, and arrests mounted. What stood out, however, was the creativity of the resistance. Musicians staged concerts in front of troop lines, activists handed out flowers to guardsmen, and satirists mocked the heavy presence by dressing as tour guides for the occupied D.C. tour. The most viral moment, though, remained the infamous sandwich incident. A frustrated man hurled a Subway sandwich at an officer, sparking both laughter and outrage online. It became a symbol of defiance, absurd, yes, but also deeply human in its rebellion against what many saw as an occupying force, the federal footprint. Meanwhile, the daily presence of federal officers grew. The D cracked down on drug networks. IC carried out raids, sweeping up dozens of undocumented immigrants. Encampments of unhoused residents were bulldozed. Each action was presented by Trump's administration as proof of taking back the streets. But to many locals, it looked more like punishment. Critics pointed out that federal officers were targeting vulnerable groups rather than focusing on actual violent crime, which statistics showed was already declining. This fueled suspicions that the campaign wasn't about safety at all. It was about reshaping the image of D.C. to fit Trump's political narrative. National reactions. The shockwaves spread far beyond the Capitol. Across the country, governors, mayors, and members of Congress weighed in. Blue state leaders accused Trump of authoritarian overreach, warning that if he could seize D.C.'s police, no city was safe. Republican allies, however, hailed the move as bold leadership, praising him for restoring order where Democrats had failed. Cable news networks turned it into a nightly drama. Some commentators framed Trump as a land order champion. Others painted him as a dictator in the making. Social media amplified every protest, every raid, and every confrontation. What was unfolding in D.C. had become a national Rorschach test. People saw what they wanted to see, depending on where they stood politically, the shadow of other cities. But perhaps the most unsettling development came when Trump himself hinted that D.C. was only the beginning. In speeches and interviews, he openly name-checked other Democratic strongholds: Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, Oakland, Baltimore as potential candidates for similar interventions. The message was unmistakable. If he could establish a precedent in Washington, he could export the model elsewhere. For city leaders across the country, it felt like a warning shot. Their autonomy could be challenged next, especially if political winds shifted in Washington. A calculated strategy. Behind the spectacle lay a calculated political strategy. Trump had always thrived on conflict, framing himself as the strong man willing to confront chaos. By flooding the Capitol with troops and agents, he wasn't just addressing crime. He was creating a stage on which he could play the role of protector. Even as crime rates dropped nationwide, he dismissed the statistics as fake news, insisting that America's cities were war zones. His administration understood that perception mattered more than numbers. Fear, once ignited, could drive voters to seek strong leadership. He intended to be the one they turned to. The strain on democracy. But the bigger danger was subtler. Democracy depends on checks and balances, local voices, local leadership, local accountability. By overriding D.C.'s elected officials, Trump chipped away at those principles. The Capitol became an experiment in centralized control, raising fears about the erosion of democratic norms. If a city like Washington, which symbolizes American freedom to the world, could be brought under direct federal control, what did that say about the future of local governance elsewhere? The line between emergency response and political domination had blurred, and once blurred, it's hard to redraw. The human side. Beyond the political theater, real people lived the consequences. Immigrant families suddenly feared raids at any hour. Homeless communities were scattered with nowhere to go. Shopkeepers watched customers vanish as neighborhoods filled with police checkpoints. Students saw soldiers on their way to class, a reminder that their city had become a staging ground for something bigger than themselves. For them, this wasn't an abstract debate about democracy or federal power. It was daily life, reshaped by decisions made far above their heads. The road ahead. As Trump pushed to extend federal control of the police department beyond the initial 30 days, a move that would require congressional approval, the battle lines hardened. Congress itself became divided, with Republicans pushing for expanded oversight and Democrats rallying to protect D.C.'s limited self-rule. The fight wasn't just about one city anymore. It was about whether local autonomy, a cornerstone of American governance, could withstand the ambitions of a leader who viewed centralization as strength. And so, Washington, D.C. stood at the center of a storm, not just a political storm, but a test of democracy itself. Was this the start of a new era of presidential power over America's cities? Or would resistance from courts, Congress, and citizens push back hard enough to hold the line? The answer remained uncertain. But one thing was undeniable. The Capitol of the United States had become more than the seat of government. It had become the front line of a battle over the very meaning of freedom, authority, and the future of American democracy.